Okay, well, thank you. And thank you to Rich and Axel for the opportunity to come and speak here today. I looked at the agenda and I spoke with Rich on the phone, and as you can see, I changed my title. I thought I would take the opportunity to remind everybody that there are tools available out there and knowledge available out there as a landscape as a whole that relate to riparian zones. So the first thing I came up with was a model that I thought might be useful. The way we typically solve complex problems is that we've got this complex problem and we take it apart. We take it apart into pieces, and then the scientists, the Einsteins, go over here and they own them, right? They find out a lot about those little pieces, right? And then eventually somebody comes along, and nutty professors, and throw everything back in a box and assume that it's going to work somehow, and they don't fit together. So what you need are people like Qs in the world who put things together in useful ways, and I like to think of maybe the FRI program leads are supposed to be Qs. And then every once in a while you get the David Suzukis who can put things back together in these big picture issues, right? So there's a danger when you study something like riparian zones that you're going to end up, over here in this end, and you can't put things back together, right? Because they are part of landscapes, and I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of that. So a part of what I'm going to show you guys are tools that are available, but the whole package, okay, is still something that's in progress. Okay, but I just want to give you an idea of what's possible, right? So landscapes that we're talking about are disturbance-driven, right? These are fire-driven landscapes, and there are tools available. There are landscape models out there. Understanding historic landscape conditions is something that forest management agencies, that's a question they've been asking for a long time, for various reasons, right? Guidelines for restoration activities, future forest conditions, amount of old forest, and I'll show you some examples of that. And of course the problem is for past landscapes we can only go back a few decades, so we use simulation modeling. And this is some of the output of what it looks like, and this is just the Sun Pine Forest Management Area. So and the nice thing about simulation modeling is that you can do that on any scale. So I'm going to talk about just a 30,000 hectare piece of the West Fraser FMA, and it's approximately the little piece right here. So here we are at time 0. So I'll just run you through a few, the model, and I put the streams on here to show you. And the nice thing about this sort of modeling is that you can put in the different burn probabilities. And in this case, and there's significant research on this that I won't get into, the probability of burning through riparian zones is almost the same as the upland in the foothills. Okay, almost the same. So there's time 0, there's 10 years. The darker colors are old. The red would be for a new disturbance. There's 10 years, and there's an age class distribution at the top there. There's 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and I just ran it out to 100 years. It can go for thousands of years, right? So the idea is that you collect all of these snapshots, put them all together, and you can create frequency distributions, right? The frequency distributions would represent the natural range, historic range, based on historic conditions, burning conditions, which means historic climate conditions, okay? And you come up with a frequency distribution. And you can do it again on different scales. We're going to talk about the 30,000 hectare scale here, okay? So the green bars. So that's the natural range of what we're going to call, in this case, young spruce-dominated forest, and I just picked the lower foothills. So you could do this for any vegetation type on any part of the landscape that you wish. And now what you can do is you can take a look at where you're sitting. Now, when you're looking at these distributions, it's the landscape, but for the sake of argument, think riparian zones, okay? This is the same, almost the same, okay? Almost the same thing as the natural range of age classes for riparian zones for spruce-dominated in the lower foothills, okay? So, and I haven't been asked to specifically pull these out, but it's possible, and I just know from the probabilities of burning in this case that the frequency distribution would be very, very similar. Okay? So there's young, there's pole or immature, and you can see that they're, you know, on both ends. That's the current condition here. So for both of those, we're on the lower end of the natural range. Here's the mature. Now we're starting to get up into the upper end. There's actually a huge amount of mature forest up there just waiting to become old. And here's the old. It's starting to get on the upper end. Okay, so what this is telling us that the current condition of the landscape relative to that which occurred historically means we're building up a lot of old forest. Okay, so we're building up a lot of old riparian habitat. Right? Now, let's take this idea one step further, and it'll become apparent in a minute. Think of when you walk through a forest, okay, and it's, let's say it's 30 to 40 years old, and every once in a while you run across one where it's just like a park, okay? There's nothing to trip on the ground, right? The woody debris doesn't exist, or it's all very small. And then in other cases, it takes you half an hour to cross, you know, a kilometer or 100 meters because there's so much wood on the ground. And that's because when we take a look at disturbance history, it's not just what time since the last disturbance, but it has to do with all of the disturbances before that. And we know on these landscapes that disturbance is so common that you get disturbance, disturbance, disturbance. Every once in a while, one area is going to get hit with 3 fires or 4 fires within 80 years. All right, and that's just the way it goes. And so if we start to break that out, and I only did for this, and this, I'm just calling this a neutral model, okay, which means I just distributed according to a negative exponential curve of an age class distribution of the existing amounts. So here's that, you know, the 25% in young, 30 in immature, 10% in old. Well, here's how it breaks down. Okay, and this is the easiest one to use as young. That's going to be the most obvious as to whether the previous fire before that last one took, you know, was it 10 years apart or was it 200? Okay. So why would we care about that? Well, in the bigger picture, they're going to be fundamentally different kinds of habitat. But what I'm going to talk about today is a large woody debris, because this is an area that we've done quite a bit of work on. So for the sake of argument, and there is no literature on this, so I'm making this part up. For the sake of argument, let's say that there are 4 groups of quality and quantity of woody debris. Okay, there's going to be size, there's going to be the frequency that the woody debris is created, there's going to be density, and there's going to be function. Okay, I grouped all of those together and thought, okay, we're really talking about 4 main categories according to this matrix here. We're talking about very little woody debris. Okay, we're talking about on the landscape and in streams now, in riparian zones. And that's where you would get those rapid fire disturbances, fires that would burn everything up. You would get ones where you have mostly pole size, okay, where there's going to be a mixture, and those are going to be older stands, so you're going to get the wood from disturbance, you're going to get self-thinning, you're starting to get gap dynamics, and you're going to have legacies from the previous disturbance. And then up here, where, you know, it's sort of, if you're going to have extended periods of 100, 150 years between disturbances, you're going to get very few large pieces. Okay? So if we apply those different colors there, so that purple is that bar right there, and the blue represents that bar right there. Okay? So let's say that that is the woody debris condition, natural average woody debris condition. There's going to be huge variation. So across a landscape, here's what it might look like. Okay, here's that same 30,000 hectare area. The different codes represent different woody debris conditions. And the only point I'm trying to make here is that there's a healthy distribution of all of that in the streams, right? There's going to be huge areas, and you guys know that, where you think, why isn't there any woody debris here? I can't find anything. And then you go to other areas and there's huge amounts, okay? So that's a natural phenomenon. And here's what the distribution looks like. Now here's potentially the current condition of the landscape, okay? So remember those frequency distributions of the H-class distributions. Not much young and immature, lots of mature, and lots of old. So it means you're going to get lots more of the blue and the this funny barfy color here, and not much in the yellow and purple. Okay, so we're starting to skew the landscape in terms of woody debris distribution already. And then where is this going? Well, if we're not going to respect that these are disturbance-driven landscapes, then this is only going to be heading in one direction. And pretty soon all you're going to have is all of your, most of your riparian zones with those occasional large pieces of wood. Now, who cares? Wood's wood, isn't it? As long as a stream has wood, then it doesn't really matter. Well, it turns out not so much. There are 4 distinct classes of woody debris in streams that perform 4 very different functions. The bridges tend to be, and actually they relate. We can predict the movement from one to another, and we're working on this part. So we're not, this part we're not, I'm back to reality now, I'm not making anything up. They start out as bridges, fairly solid. They break apart, they fall down in the stream, they become partial bridges. They become loose in the stream bed, and then eventually embedded in the stream bed. Okay? And they move from one phase to the other, and those numbers there are important because they give you an idea of how they transition from one to the other. So for something that's going to function in the stream bed, and think about something that catches smaller woody debris or gravel behind it, starts to create opportunities for the stream to meander. Those pieces don't happen for several decades after a piece of wood is made available as woody debris. Okay? There's a process, there's time involved here, right? Now, this is woody debris by position. So this is actual data. This is out of the work that we've done on woody debris in the streams in the foothills, small streams, okay, in the foothills. This is how it breaks down in terms of volume, all right? Bridges and partial bridges mostly. The embedded and the stream bed parts it's less. And that makes sense, right? Because they're going to be decaying over time. And remember, some of it takes decades. And once they become loose and embedded, some of it is probably going to be swept downstream. Okay? And we've got some information on that as well for small streams. So if we're protecting riparian zones, if they're not being disturbed, if we're removing fire from them, okay, protecting them from fire, not replacing it with something else, are we headed towards this, right? Which means the opportunity for wood that is small, that is performing different functions in the stream are eliminated, okay? And you think, well, if that's, you know, is that a big deal? And so we would ask, you know, Q, we probably wouldn't get David Suzuki, but Q might come and do it for us. What if we inadvertently, over time, and we could be doing it right now, right? Remember that lag time, okay? We might not see impacts for another 10 or 20 years, but it's already happening, okay? So what if we're inadvertently creating a landscape where woody debris is generated infrequently, so it only comes from old stuff, it's only large, and it happens everywhere at the same time. So you don't get that patchwork anymore of different woody debris loads and types across the landscape. It's all the same. It's mostly large logs, and they're going to take a long time to decay, and they may not ever turn, because they're so large, they may not ever turn into something that's going to function in the stream. Okay? And the answer to this, I mean, this is something that we could debate, and I think it's a really good question. But it seems that fundamentally you could argue that it's going to have some impact, and probably negative, on the ability of those streams to mitigate floods, create spawning pools and hiding cover, collect sediment behind for those, you know, those important spawning pools that Rich was talking about this morning, filtering toxins, you know, and on it goes, right? So the health of riparian zones could be significantly negatively influenced if we don't pay attention to the big picture, to the landscape, okay? So, and I only used woody debris as an example here because it's is something that we have a lot of information on. We're creating pieces of these models right now, but I pieced it together to show you what could be done. And certainly those landscape scale models are readily available to understand dynamics in the landscape. Okay, but one can imagine that if we're isolating and treating and modeling pieces of riparian zones separately from the rest of the landscape, it's probably not going to end well. And it was actually good to see in Rich's talk that he talked about watersheds, you know, the multi-scalar nature of that. I think it's just, again, a reminder that something to keep in mind. And there are landscape scale tools out there. So just because they're landscape scale tools, don't ignore them. Okay? They're going to be, they're out there, they're available, and they can be valuable. And a final reminder that things like woody debris can come back and bite you in a few decades. And if we, you know, sort of reactionary about things, that by the time it comes along and we realize, oh man, we've got a problem because we don't have woody debris in here that's, you know, trapping sediment and stopping, you know, when we get, you know, even 10 or 20-year floods, they're causing a lot more damage than they used to. And a good example of that actually is in Michigan. They've got a much longer history of fire control. It's sort of sub-boreal. I mean, you can call it boreal forest. It's the very, very southern edge. But they've been extremely successful at putting fires out, and for much longer than we have here. And they figure they've changed the fire cycle to about 3,000 years. And their biggest problem right now, they're trying to figure out how to resolve, is wetlands and anything associated with water bodies. Because they fundamentally changed habitat types and even water flows and water quality to the point where they realize that it's the removal of disturbance that's caused it. And now they can't just go and start putting it back in all at once.